Samma Sambuddhassa, Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa, Aparotate Sang Namatassa Dwara, Yeso Tavanto Pamanchantu Sadhanti. Okay, very good. So here we are now to begin the second session, talking about Kamma and Rebirth in early Buddhism. And for this session I would like to discuss something about the various kind of myths that that surround the topic of Kamma and Rebirth, and to be able to see which one of those might be true and which ones might be not so true, and which ones might be sometimes half true and sometimes half not true, and so on. So let's have a look at some of these myths. So, as a word of warning, prepare to be challenged, okay? Prepare to have your ideas thrown in the dustbin, right? That's what we come here for. We don't come to Buddhism so that we can have all of our prejudices confirmed, okay? We come to Buddhism because we know that we're ignorant and we need a challenge and we need to change, we need to grow. So sometimes the things that we think are the most obvious and the most sort of hallowed ideas that we've been told so many times and we believe for so long, and sometimes they are the ones which are the most holding us back from understanding things in a deeper way. So anyway, I have a bit of a list here, so I'm going to go through this list. It's not meant to be comprehensive, and it's not meant to be in any particular order, but it is meant to sort of pick up a few of the more important ideas and so on which we find in the teaching of Kamma and Rebirth, which many of you may have heard of, and which will be we'll see whether they make sense, we'll see whether they agree with what the Buddha taught, and they'll see if they agree with the evidence. Okay, so I've got a few ones down here, so I'll just sort of start with perhaps the most important one, is the idea that everything is because of karma. Right? Now this is an idea which is so pervasive in the world, not just in Buddhism, but in right throughout Hinduism as well. And it's also permeated a lot of the popular culture that we see around the place. And this idea that anything that happens to you is your karma. And maybe you'll get sick and you'll say, oh, it's my karma, right? Or maybe there's a natural disaster and people say, oh, it was their karma. Or, somebody loses all their money in the stock exchange. It was their karma, right? So many different things can happen. Oh, it's your karma. Well, the first thing to say if somebody says that is, really? Really? You can see that person's past lives? Right? If you say that's your karma, you can see their past lives and you know what act they did in their past life, and you can trace the cause and effect from that act down to this result. You can see all those things for yourself. And if they say no, you say, well, what are you talking about then, right? You're just making it up. This idea that everything is your karma is just something that people make up. And actually, it struck me at one time when I hear the way that people in the Buddhist community use this, it reminds me very much of how people use the word God in theistic communities, right? So if you're a Muslim, then you say like Inshallah, right? It's the will of Allah. If you're a Christian, you say, oh, it's the will of God, or God moves in mysterious ways, these kinds of things. Well, what does that mean, right? You say, oh, it's God's will that this happened. What do you know about God's will? Right? You're reading the mind of God, are you? Right? Of course not. It's just words that people use to fill up space. These are not words that actually have any meaning. And it's the same thing with this idea of karma. But people say, oh, it's because of your karma. You don't know what your karma is. You don't know what someone did in the past, how it results in the present day. So when you say, oh, it's your karma, or it was my karma, it's just words, completely empty. Right? And so when those words, they don't have any actual meaning in terms, they don't relate to any reality, but what they do is that they provide a sense of comfort. And they help us to cope with things by making sense of them. Right? If you say, oh, that's your karma, then in a sense what it does is it allows you to say all these terrible things that happen in the world, well, they are terrible, and I find it hard to deal with them. But if I think of them as being somehow related to the Dhamma and to the Buddha's teachings, then at least I can deal with that, right? At least I can be a bit comforted by that. It's not totally random. It's not chaotic, right? So it gives a structure to things. It reassures us that the world is fundamentally sensible, right? Because the problem with that is that the world actually isn't all that sensible. And the world actually is chaotic. And bad things do happen to good people all the time. And we've seen that in Sydney very recently, the terrible events in Martin Place. You know, the people getting caught in there and terrorised in that cafe. Is that their karma? You say to those people, it was your karma that you were there? What, you all made some kind of special being terrorised in a Lint cafe karma in past lives, right? So that you all got there. Really? Seems very strange, doesn't it? Yeah? So how many people in the room today here have an iPhone? Who has iPhones? How many people have Android phones? Yeah? Okay, very good. So all of you made smartphone karma in your past life, right? Some of you obviously made better smartphone karma, so you got to have iPhones. And some of you made worse smartphone karma, so you got to have Android phones, or depending on which way you look at it, there may be some argument about that particular point, right? But what is clear is that no previous generation of people ever made smartphone karma, right? But only a couple of generations ago, people started making smartphone karma, and magically, smartphones appeared in the world. Poof! They just came because of karma. Nothing to do with, you know, development of technology and science and infrastructure and research and resources and minerals and all of those kinds of things, right? Bing, karma, and there you go, you have a nice phone, right? So this idea that everything is due to your karma is complete nonsense. And it doesn't withstand half a minute's serious reflection, okay? And yet it's something that people say all the time. And I'm not going to name any names, but you even find well-known Buddhist teachers who will kind of comment on events. You have the tsunami, tragic tsunami of several years ago, and people will say, oh, is there karma? What? Terrible thing to say. It's not karma that does those things, right? It was weather, right? It was the natural forces that created those things. It's got nothing to do with karma. When somebody gets sick, is that because of their karma? You say, oh, in Buddhism, oh, somebody gets sick and, oh, it's your karma. Are you sick because of your karma? That means that every illness is a sign of a moral failing, right? There's something wrong with you, morally wrong with you. That's why you're getting sick. Now we contrast this with the Buddha's teachings, okay? So to take that particular issue of illness, okay? And this is actually addressed explicitly in several suttas, most famously in the Girimananda Sutta, which is a very common sutta recited in the Theravadan countries, but also in many other suttas. And we find the Buddha actually lists a whole series of causes of diseases, right? Utu parinamaja abadharis, illnesses arisen from the weather. Visama pariharaja abadharis is illness that's arisen from unaccustomed activity, or the pittusamutana, like is the illnesses which is arisen from imbalances in the humours and the energies in the body, right? And this also is another source of illness, and so on and so forth. So many, many different kinds of illness, and one of those kinds of illness is kamma vipakaja abada, is illness which is arisen as a result of karma. Okay? So some illnesses sometimes might be originated from karma. Many illnesses, much of the time, are not. Right? And who are you to know the difference? Right? Who are you to know the difference? So we can't know if somebody gets sick. We don't know whether that's their karma or not, or anything like that. Maybe they were just standing in front of a truck and they got hit by the truck. Maybe that's the actual reason. Maybe they were living in the wrong place and there was chemicals in the water and then they got cancer. Maybe it could be any number of things. So many different causes that illnesses have. And so we can't say that all illnesses are from karma, but what we can say is that when somebody gets sick, right, How do we respond to that? That's our karma, right? And if somebody gets sick and we say to them, that's your karma, deal with it, right? We're not being compassionate, we're not being loving, we're not being kind. So the karma is the karma that we make when we see misfortune, right? How do you respond to it? What choices do you make? And this is something which can be very cruel, and which we really need to think about and reflect on as a Buddhist community. Last year I met a student at the Sydney Uni. She's actually studying at Brisbane Uni, a Sri Lankan lady who's disabled. And she's doing her thesis on this topic of how that teaching on karma really affects people with disabilities in Sri Lanka. And that very often, and she's finding that people is dismissed, that it's your karma, and so there's very little effort and attempt to actually help people with that situation. When I was in Germany last year, I taught a retreat, and this blind lady came on retreat. And this is a very, very interesting episode, and this is a very good thing to think about in the context of karma. And she was blind, and she came to the retreat, and the first thing that she asked me was, does Buddhism say that if you're blind, that there's something wrong with you because that's your karma? That's what she asked me. And I said, no. I said, why do you say that? And she responded that she had a friend who also was blind, who was traveling somewhere in some Buddhist country, I can't remember, and this is what they were told. And so I said, no, that's not true. And so being blind is not a sign of moral failing. Okay. Now, what was interesting in that particular context is that she was a very, very good example of somebody who was a complete counter-argument to that. Okay. She was living in Germany. She was Jewish, and she was a singer. Right? Her profession was to sing traditional Jewish songs, and because of that, she got targeted by some of the extremist neo-Nazi youth at that time. Right? They came and they threw a rock through a window of a house and so on, and did these things to intimidate her. And so she was. She went through a crisis in her life, and she's thinking, what do I do? Do I just give up my life's work, my vocation, because of this intimidation? Or how do I respond? Right? So this is that choice where you have to learn what is your karma. So then she thought, I'm not going to be intimidated, right? I'm going to learn karate. So that's what she did. So she went and studied martial arts, right? And she became so good at it. She's now, in fact, the top-ranked woman in that discipline of martial arts in all of Europe, and she actually teaches martial arts for a living. Okay? And she's blind. Yeah? So the next time she was walking through the streets, and she heard these boots behind her, right? And she said, you can tell the sound of these neo-Nazi youth, right? Because they go in their gangs and they have their heavy boots. And she knew these guys were following behind her, and she just waited until the right time. And then she whirled around in a karate pose with a white cane raised up to confront these guys, and they stopped and ran away. So that's her choice. Yeah? That's her choice. How do you actually respond? And that's the karma that people make. Not they're saying you're condemned to that because of that situation, but how do you choose to live your life? This is the karma. This is how you can. This is how we create karma in the present moment. So how do we respond when there are people like that who are around us, right? Now at that retreat, I saw something which in all my time in Buddhism I've never seen before or since. Okay. And that is that when that blind woman was coming along, she only came for one day of the retreat. But the organizer for the retreat had made for her the chanting all in Braille. So she had spent hours and hours and hours typesetting by hand all of the Pali chanting in Braille. Right? To give to this woman so she could come for that retreat and she could join in. Yeah? I've never seen that before. And that was, to me, was so touching and so beautiful that somebody would go to that effort to do that, to help somebody. So this is what we should be doing. This is what we should be cultivating. Not condemning people and criticizing. It's your problem, it's your karma. But how do we help? That's our karma. What are the choices we make in the present? Okay, so this is that one of the myths that we can thoroughly bust, okay? Everything is due to your karma. It's not. I should mention just briefly here in the Pali commentaries they developed this idea of the 5 niyamas. Actually, this is not from the suttas as such, but it's very much in harmony with teachings in the suttas. They talk about the 5 niyamas, pancha niyama. Niyama means something like a system of natural law. And the 5 niyamas, the first one is uttu, is the weather, and then bija is seeds or genetics. Third one is kamma, and chitta and dhamma, right? So karma is your actions, your choices. Chitta is the psychological laws, and dhamma is the laws of the Dhamma, like the Four Noble Truths, dependent origination, and so on. So these are 5 kinds of natural law that exist in the world, and you can see that that's very true. And we have similar kinds of divisions in modern science. You know, you have physics and chemistry, which deal with the inorganic laws, and you have biology, which deals with the organic laws, and so on. Psychology deals with the chitta niyama and the laws of the mind and so on. So these are, and they all interact, right? These are not things which sort of exist independently, but they're things which work together all of the time. And our experience and our life consists of the interaction of all of these things all of the time. So of course karma plays an important role in that, right? And karma is especially crucial when we're considering like what is our spiritual path and what is our religious path, what are our ethical choices. In that context, you know, our karma is vital, is the most important thing. And that, of course, is why the Buddha emphasizes so much. And so we need to resist the temptation to say, well, because karma is important, therefore it's everything. It's not. Okay? So some things that happen to you may be because of karma, some maybe not. But what will always be true is how you respond, how you choose to live, and that is your karma. Okay, so that's myth number 1. Let's have a look at another one, the in-between state. Okay, so this is another one which is talked about often in Buddhism, and just to give you a bit of a background here, this idea of rebirth, right? You have one life, and then you have another life, right? But what happens in between? Okay, and the different schools of Buddhism had different interpretations of this. Most schools of Buddhism had the idea that there's an in-between state, so that you between one life and another there was a period of time, like a passing on, a journey. Whereas in the Theravadan school, which we find in Sri Lanka, the idea was that there was no intermediate state, that there was one life and then the next, right? So you can think of the differences a bit like, say, if you think of a house, if there's no in-between state, it's a bit like walking from one room into the next, right? You just in one place and then you're in another. Whereas if there's an in-between state, it's a bit more like, say, walking out of this building and walking into the next building, right? You sort of down the stairs and around the path and then you go in. So which one is true? Now in this case, actually the evidence in the suttas sort of very clearly shows that there was some kind of in-between state, that there is a process from one life to the next. And this is mentioned quite clearly in a number of different suttas. The most well-known one is the Metta Sutta, which we chant all the time. It says, Bhuta va sambhavesi va. And the word sambhavesi means somebody who's seeking to be reborn, okay, or someone who's going to be reborn. And this is one of the words that's used for this in-between state. And there are quite a number of other contexts in the suttas which talk about this. For example, just one other case where it mentions it incidentally is a case of talking about different kinds of anagami. Anagami is a non-returner. And it talks about one kind of anagami where they can die as an anagami, as a non-returner, but then they can cool down in between before taking rebirth in their next life. Okay? So it seems that they die, they still have some of the defilements left, but then before they get reborn, they cool down, and there's the image is given of a spark that flies off when you strike hot metal and the spark flies off and it cools down before it lands. And so this is that process of rebirth. And so there's quite a lot of suttas that talk about this. It also agrees with, of course, the many stories that we're familiar with today of near-death experiences, where there's quite clearly some kind of process that links one life with the next. so what exactly is going on here, and why is there these different points of view, and what's important about it? Well, I think the real reason why the idea that there's no intermediate birth, no intermediate state came to be is because I think it was easy to mistake that intermediate state with some kind of self or some kind of soul. Okay? Now, of course, in Buddhism, we want to distinguish the Buddha's teaching on rebirth, right, from the teaching we associate with Hinduism, also Jainism and some other Indian religions, which is the rebirth of a soul or a self. Okay? So I believe, this is only my own conjecture, I believe that the idea to reject the intermediate state was because it was associated with, or was kind of sullied by the idea of a self or soul. It sounded like a soul. But it doesn't need to be like that, right? So there's no particular connection between the idea of having an in-between state and the idea of having a soul. On the contrary, actually an intermediate state is a process. It's not really a state at all. It's a process which shifts and changes. And that's, of course, not what a soul is. A soul is something that remains the same. If you ever think about how the Buddha talked about rebirth, one of the most common phrases that the Buddha, or common idioms or metaphors that the Buddha used to talk about rebirth was he used it in terms of your dwelling places. Okay? So Pubbe Nivasanu is the normal word for recollecting past lives. Okay? So in English we say to remember your past lives. In Pali it says Pubbe Nivasa is to recollect your previous dwellings. Okay? Literally is a dwelling or house. Okay? And it gives the simile of if somebody has the ability to see that process of rebirth, it gives a simile like a man who's standing on a balcony in a village and they're looking down on the street below and they see people walking out of one dwelling, walking along the road and walking into another. Walking out of this house, walking down the road and walking into another house. And they can see that process going on. So, remember before I gave that kind of analogy, where is it walking from one room to another, or is it like walking down the street? Well, this is the metaphor that the Buddha gave. He said it's like walking down a street. The Buddha was very good at using metaphors. He was very precise at using them. If he wanted to say it's like a person walking from one room to another, he would have said that. But clearly he wanted to depict something which shows a process of change. And I think this idea of understanding rebirth as like moving house is actually a very useful and very quite a rich metaphor to apply in the context of rebirth. Okay, we think about that, is rebirth instantaneous or not? Think about that in the context of moving house. Is moving house instantaneous or not? Right? Well, it kind of depends, doesn't it? It's usually not, but sometimes it might be fairly instantaneous, right? I mean, you might just move next door, right? Maybe your wife kicks you out, you just grab a bag and you go next door, that's it, right? And it's fairly much instantaneous, yeah? So sometimes it might be like that, but more likely it's going to take some time. But when is the actual time that you move house? Okay? You think about it, what's the moment that you move house? Well, there isn't one, is there? Right? There's a moment when you first think, oh, maybe I should move house, and then you look up the real estate listings. And then you go and visit a place, and you say, oh, I like this place, I'd like to move in here, right? Does that mean you've moved? Well, not really, but you're starting to get attached to that place, right? If the real estate agent says to you, oh, sorry, we've already got an offer on that house, you'll feel a bit disappointed, right? You already had some attachment to that place, so you feel a little bit disappointed, but not all that much disappointed, right? So you go and you find another place. And then another place you think, oh, I'm really going to move here. And you do all the negotiations, right, this is all going ahead. And you get the financing, you're all ready to move. And then the owner changes his mind and says, no, we're not going to sell, right? So you're more disappointed, right? Because you've gone further down that road, your attachments were stronger to that place. So the longer you go down that process, right, the stronger your attachments are and the more suffering you have when that is severed, right? But, you know, is moving house when you sign the contract, right? Well, not really, because maybe you sign the contract, it might still be months before you actually move in, right? So is it when you get the financing sorted out? Well, is it when you finish paying it off? Is it when you walk across the threshold? Right? Is it when you spend your first night in the home? Right? Is it when you redecorate it and put all your furniture and belongings there and you finally feel at home? When is the actual moment when you move home? Well, there isn't one. Okay? It's just a process. And any moment that we choose to say this is the time when you move house, that's kind of arbitrary. And of course, it'll be very different for different people. Right? Some people might take years to move home. Right? You move out of one into another and you drift around from here to there. You're not quite sure where to settle. It might take ages. Other people happen straight away. So this, I think, is a very, very rich and very useful metaphor to think about in terms of rebirth and karma. So if you've got a strong, think about it, if you have a strong karma, right? So you have like a clear mind, then your moving home is likely to also be quite clear, right? If you so someone with good karma is like somebody who not only knows where they want to live and what kind of house they want and so on, but they also have the money in the bank to be able to do it and to make everything happen, right? Whereas someone with very bad karma, well, they've over-mortgaged their house, they've gone bankrupt, they don't have any money, no one will give them a loan, right? And they end up on the streets, right? And so this is as a result of your bad karma. So the clarity and force of your karma will determine that to some extent. Right? So this is this idea of the in-between state. So I don't think the in-between state is, I think the word calling it a state is probably a mistake. It's more like an in-between process or an in-between journey. Right? It's a shift from one state to another. And typically, if we look in our life, every change that we go through, right, takes time. We have to adjust. We don't just instantaneously go from one to another. It might be a short period of adjustment, but typically, there's always some kind of process involved there. So I think that in this case, the idea that there is an in-between state not only agrees with the suttas, it agrees with the experience of people who have had near-death experiences and so on, and I think also it agrees with common sense. So I think that this is probably correct. Okay, moving on. Next myth, to bust or not bust. Collective karma. Okay, so this is an idea which is quite popular these days. People talk about collective karma. So what does collective karma mean? Well, it's a kind of, I think, a bit of a variant on the idea that everything is due to karma. I mentioned before, like the tsunami, right? And so in the wake of the tsunami, some people are coming along and saying, oh, it was their karma, right? So here we not only have the ethical choices that people make somehow magically making waves appear in the ocean. I don't know how that works. I've never actually seen that actually happening. Okay? I've seen that if somebody does an act of kindness, that they feel happy about it, right? And I've seen that, and I've seen that if you do an act of kindness, that other people will tend to do acts of kindness for you. That's something that I've seen. But I've never seen somebody doing an act of kindness and a wave appearing in the ocean as a result of that. This is not something I've experienced so far. Maybe I need to look closer, but I don't think that tsunamis appear as a result of karma. But even if it is something to do with karma, collective karma, right? You're thinking that all of those thousands or millions of people who were affected by the tsunami somehow all did the same thing together? It's a bit crazy, I think. I've heard it taught in a variety of different contexts. When I was in Thailand many years ago, somebody asked the question one time, why is it that Cambodia has been such a troubled country? Why have they had so many bad problems and things to go through? And seem to be taking, they've suffered terrible war and the slaughter of so many people and so many things, and it seems to be taking very difficult for them to solve their problems and to move forward. And then somebody answered that the reason was because Cambodia had been full of black magic, right? And they had the Buddha's teachings, but they had neglected the Buddha's teachings, and they were all into doing spells and amulets and rituals and magic and all of these kinds of things. And this is something which is quite well known in Thailand, right? So in Thailand, the Khmer black magic is like the best black magic you can get, right? So if you want to cast spells on somebody or do like a love charm or sort of, you know, hex your neighbour or something like that, then if you can get some Khmer magic to do that, then that's the best, right? So this was the argument. But then, of course, you know, again, you kind of think about it. Well, were there people doing those things? Sure. Is that bad karma? Sure, right? But was everybody doing that, right? Were the little children doing that, right? It's not something that everybody does. It's something that some people do. And if a person does that, then yes, they will read the karma from that. But it doesn't mean that everybody in that society is going to get it, right? So the reason why that country went through those problems was because of things that we can see and observe. We don't need any kind of magical explanation. You know, we can see the politics of the situation, the involvement in the Vietnam War, we can see the communist thing that happened and so on and so forth. And there are ordinary, everyday political and social and economic reasons for what happened, and we don't have to go around invoking the law of karma for that. So this is just another example of that collective karma. Now, there is such a thing as collective karma in a very kind of limited sense, in the sense that if we make the same choice together, right? So you can make a choice as a group, and so people do that, right? So, for example, you might have a temple here, right? So you have a committee in the temple, and the committee makes decisions, okay? So that even though the committee is comprised of individuals, right, but the committee as a whole makes a decision. So if the committee makes a decision to build a beautiful Dhamma hall like this, then of course they're making that good karma from making that choice, okay? So in a sense that's kind of collective karma because they've made a choice as a group, but actually, really it's just that they're making individual karma, but they're doing it at the same time, right? So the karma is always individual, even though, you know, in a certain sense that groups can make choices, but it's actually each one is making an individual karma at that time. So the idea of collective karma is really not something that the Buddha talked about, and he always talked about karma sakonghi. One of the most basic teachings on karma is you are the owner of your karma, yeah? Karma sakonghi. So this is something which is very important. And actually leads on to another thing, which is another one of the myths which needs to discussing, is can you share your karma? Right? So this is something that we do very often in Buddhism, that we like dedicate the merits, right? And so we talk about sharing our merits. So can you share merits? If you're the owner of your karma, right, you're the heir of your karma, how can you give your karma away to anybody else? Is that possible? Can you give your karma to somebody else? Well, no. The short answer to that is no, you can't. Right? Of course you can't. It's your karma. You can't give it away. Right? But what the Pali word, when we say to share merits, actually the Pali word for that is a bit different. The Pali word is uddisa, which doesn't really mean to share merits, but it means something more like to dedicate. Okay? So we do an act and we dedicate it to the memory or to the thought of somebody who's passed away or something like that. So it's not quite the idea of sharing, but it's more the idea of that, we're bearing that person in mind and we're doing this act in their name, which is a bit different from sharing our merits. Now, what you can do, though, is even though you can't literally share karma with anybody else, right, but we are always influenced by others, right? And in fact, our karma is always done in relation to others. Even though we're the owner of our karma, but we do our karma in relation to others. And the choices that we make, right, powerfully influence all of those around us. In fact, this is fundamental to the notion of choice and to what we want to do. All right? What we want essentially is what somebody else wants. Right? I mean, this is how the world works. This is how advertising works, right? Every ad, basically, what do? You get a beautiful person and you have them enjoying some product, right? That's the basis of 95% of ads. Right? So you identify with that person. I want to be like person. That person's everything that I want to be. They are beautiful and happy and wealthy and successful. Their life is fulfilled and so on because they're drinking that particular soda. And you think, wow, if only I was to have that, then my life would too. I would be beautiful and happy and wealthy and I would enjoy my life. Of course, you don't think that, right? We all know that that's stupid, but you still go and buy the drink anyway, right? This is the thing, is that even though we know that it's dumb, it still affects us. Right? Why? Because this is how desire works. We want something because somebody else wants it. Right? Sometimes they call it the triangulation of desire. Right? You look in the world today, I've mentioned before about iPhones and smartphones and this kind of thing, and these days they're such an object of desire, aren't they? Right? Everybody wants a phone, he's got to have the latest one, and it's like, wow, this one's got more pixels than mine does, or this one is better, and you get really envious and you try to get the latest one and all these things. Why? Right? 20 years ago, no one cared about smartphones, right? Right? Why is it that now it's such an object of desire, right? Because you see other people using it, right? And it builds up, and these things become an object of desire because they are desired by somebody else. So this is why, if we make those choices, if we make bad choices, right? Whether we like it or not, we are spreading that bad energy around, right? It's connecting with others and it's moving others in that bad way. And if we make good choices, we are bringing others and inspiring others and bringing them along. Okay? This happens all the time. It happens whether we know about it, whether we care about it, whether we talk about it. It's just happening. So in that sense, yes, we can share our merits and share our karma, right? Because we are encouraging and supporting for others to do that. So, and that creates actually good karma in other beings, whether beings that we can see or invisible beings or whatever. But when they know that we're doing some good karma, especially if we're maybe doing some good karma in their name, then they can feel happy because of that. They can rejoice. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. It's what a wonderful thing. And when they rejoice in that, then they are making good karma because of their own rejoicing. Not because you've transferred your karma over to somebody else, but because they feel a connection. And because they tune into the energy that you're creating, the good energy that you're creating through doing karma. Okay? So this is an idea of sharing merit. Okay. Let's see if we can get a few more myths done. Okay, another myth is that you can burn off your karma by meditating on pain. Right? This is a good one. You'll find this is taught in a number of different by a number of different meditation teachers in different contexts and so on. And so the idea is that if you go and do meditation, you sit there and it hurts. You sit there and you go, ow, 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 but it must be good for me, right? Oh, ow, 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 ow. If the longer that I sit here and hurt, then the more all of that beautiful bad karma is being burnt away. It's like a fire, and I can feel the fire of pain going through all my limbs, and that fire must be the fire that's burning off all that bad karma, right? Have you ever heard that idea in meditation circles? You hear it around sometimes. It depends who you're listening to, but this is an idea that you hear sometimes. Actually, this is pure Jainism, right? This is not a Buddhist teaching at all. And this is exactly what the Jains taught, is that we have our karma, and that when we experience pain, that we will burn that karma off. And the word they use for that in Pali is tapas. Tapas literally meaning a fire or a burning, and it's used as a word for the austere practices which the Jains would do and other ascetics would do. So the idea is that you torture yourself until all your karma goes. So this, of course, is one of the extremes which the Buddha condemned in the first sermon, right? The extreme of self-mortification, attakilamatthana yoga, right? So burning off all of your bad karma. I find it extraordinary that this kind of idea, which was so clearly and explicitly rejected by the Buddha on multiple occasions, has found its way into Buddhism and is taught as if it's a kind of Buddhist meditation. So when you're meditating, don't think that by sitting there and enduring pain that somehow you're going to get rid of all your bad karma. Okay? On the contrary, sorry to disappoint you, but you're actually making bad karma by making yourself hurt. right? By wishing if you're wanting to experience that pain, you're actually creating bad karma. The path of Buddhism and the path of Buddhist meditation is a path of happiness, right? Not a path of pain. So yeah, of course, when you're meditating, just as in life, you're going to feel some pain now and then. That's all right. And of course, yeah, we learn to be patient with that. We learn to accept it, right? But you don't look upon it as something which is especially virtuous. There's nothing particularly virtuous about experiencing pain. It's just a feeling, right? So if pain comes in your meditation, that's all right. If it's too much, that's fine. Just get up and move. Don't make a big deal about it. Don't let your meditation be about pain, okay? If you look at all of the times, did the Buddha mention pain in the context of meditation? Yes, he did, in a few places. Right? Did he mention pleasure in meditation? Always. All the time. Every time the Buddha talked about meditation, it's always talking about pleasure. Okay? So occasionally, yes, there's also a mention that pain, you will experience pain from time to time, and you have to learn to accept that and be patient with it. But that's not what he emphasized. What he emphasized was happiness. So much so that in Pali, the word sukha, which means happiness or pleasure, in some cases is almost a synonym for meditation. Okay? So when we do the Anumodana chant, amongst the Anumodana, we say Ayu Wano Sukhang Balang, right? And these have an ordinary everyday meaning, right? Ayu is long life, Wana is beauty, Sukha is pleasure, happiness, and Bala is good health. Right? But the Buddha also gave these a spiritual meaning as well as their ordinary everyday meaning. Right? So the spiritual meaning of Ayu is to practice long life, is to practice the 4 iddhipadas, right? The 4 bases of psychic power. The spiritual meaning of Wana, of beauty, is keeping one's precepts, sila. The spiritual meaning of Sukha, right? Happiness, is the 4 jhanas. And the spiritual meaning of bala, or good health, is the power to eradicate all defilements and become an arahant. So that word sukha, or pleasure or happiness, in some cases, it's virtually a synonym for meditation and for deep meditation. So we should never think in Buddhism that the path of meditation is the path of pain. Right? And Ajahn Brahm tells a story about this once, that he was being taken around a meditation center, and they showed him, here's the offices, here's the huts, here's the meeting hall, and here's the torture chamber. And he's like, sorry? They have a torture chamber in a meditation center? And they opened the door, and of course that was the meditation hall. Right? So that's the torture chamber. That's where you go to experience pain. So this is another one of those myths. So you don't burn off your karma by meditating on pain. Okay, and well, some more myths. Another one is that the Buddha taught, and you find this one's a very common one, the Buddha taught karma and rebirth because of the cultural views at the time. Okay? Right, so this is something which is quite a common idea in modern circles and secularist circles and things. They say that in ancient India everyone believed in the doctrine of karma and so on, and the Buddha had to teach that in order to conform to the cultural views at the time. What complete nonsense this is. My goodness, how anybody, a 14-year-old school child is capable of critical reflection on the social ideas that are around them, and is capable of rejecting an idea that's found in their society. And somebody can seriously suggest that the Buddha was not capable of the level of critical reflection that any high school student is capable of? This is the most ridiculous idea that I've ever heard in my life, and yet we find it repeated over and over again. What nonsense. So anybody who's actually a student of ancient Indian history would know that the doctrine of karma and rebirth is very far from being a universal idea in the different religions and philosophies that were taught in the time of the Buddha. On the contrary, it was probably quite an unusual idea. It wasn't an idea that was unique to Buddhism, and it wasn't an idea that was invented by the Buddha. It was already around, but it was one of many competing ideas which were present in the society at that time. what really characterizes the religious scene in the time of the Buddha was diversity. And there was an incredible range of different kinds of ideas. Many of the teachers at the time completely rejected the notion of karma and rebirth. Some of them said there's no such thing as rebirth, you just live one life and that's it. Others said yes, there are many lifetimes, but what you do makes no difference, right? So they'd say they accept the idea of rebirth, but not the idea of karma. So your lives are predestined, right? So there are all these different ranges of views that people had, and the Buddha, as always, used his unparalleled critical and mind and his wisdom to investigate and look at all of these different views, to accept those which he saw agreed with the truth, and to reject those which did not. So one of the problems here is that even though in the time of the Buddha the idea of karma and rebirth was I think a somewhat unusual one, it's rarely, if ever, found in the Brahmanical teachings which predate the Buddha. Okay, so these days we tend to think of Hinduism, and we think that Hinduism believes in karma and rebirth and so on and so forth, but we have to get ourselves out of the mindset to think that Hinduism even existed in the time of the Buddha. Hinduism didn't exist in the time of the Buddha, right? What existed was there was a Vedic tradition, a Brahmanical tradition, and many different religious and philosophical traditions which believed in different kinds of things, some of which have a relation to modern Hinduism, some of which don't. All throughout the Vedas, there's no mention of karma and rebirth in that kind of sense, right? In the Upanishads, the idea of karma and rebirth is mentioned in one place, clearly, that there's spoken of karma, and teachings on rebirth are diverse. Often rebirth is conceived as being more like a physical process, that when you die, you're somehow reborn on the moon, and then when the dews come, your soul comes down and goes into the grass, and then is reborn in the grass. You get eaten by the cows, and then your soul goes through the cows and the milk and so on. So there's these ideas of rebirth as this kind of process of nature, or cycle, like a physical cycle of nature, rather than being rebirth in the way that we understand it. So there certainly was no uniform or commonly accepted idea of rebirth in the time of the Buddha. So the Buddha did not accept karma and rebirth because of the cultural views at the time, but he accepted it, as he himself explicitly stated on many occasions, because he had seen it and verified it for himself. Okay, and so this is one of the basic teachings on the kinds of knowledges which the Buddha had, was to be able to recollect past lives and see beings being reborn according to their karma, is what he could see according to his own direct knowledge, and not because of the culture at the time. So I think we maybe have time to discuss one more myth before we finish up for this session. And so for the last one, I want to examine the idea that rebirth as a woman is because of bad karma. So is this true or not, ladies? Rebirth as a woman is because of bad karma. Really? It's a very common idea, isn't it? Yeah, and I think it's very disturbing how this idea is not only, not only do you find men saying this, but you find often that women internalize it, and very commonly in Buddhist cultures. In Tibetan, for example, the word for woman translates literally as like a lesser being. Okay. And certainly when I was in Thailand, this would be the normal answer. If you'd ask most of the Thai women, is being reborn as a woman because of bad karma, you usually say, yeah, of course. Yeah? And not all of them, but this is a very common belief. So is this true? No, of course it's not true. Don't be ridiculous, right? My goodness, how people can say these things, I do not know. What silliness. There's nothing in any of the Buddha's teachings that suggests that rebirth as a woman in any way is due to bad karma. And on the contrary, the Buddha was very affirming of women's abilities. He was one of the few spiritual teachers that very clearly and explicitly said that women can become fully enlightened. Right? And think about that, how powerful that is, right? You don't have to sort of, we don't have to hedge around the question, right? You know, we don't have to sort of argue about it or anything. The Buddha clearly said women can become fully enlightened. So then, you know, what about the view? There's a view in the suttas. There's a view that women have very weak wisdom. Okay, so this is a view that you find taught in the suttas. Women have only very small wisdom. It uses the phrase two-fingered wisdom, right? So you can't like really grasp something. So women can't grasp things, they can only pick them up with little two-fingered wisdom, right? So this is actually taught in the suttas. So it must be true, right? Yes? No? It is taught in the suttas, but it's taught by Mara. Okay? This is what Mara says in the suttas. Okay? Mara says that women have very weak wisdom, only two-fingered wisdom. Okay? Not the Buddha says that, Mara says it, right? And then he said that to one of the bhikkhunis, and the bhikkhuni responded by saying, Mara, look, anybody who's attached to the idea of I am a woman, or I am a man, or I am anything at all, you go and talk to them, okay? And so she just dismissed him. There's another wonderful passage where, this is actually in a later text, but it actually is a nice story, and it's a version of the story when, around the time when Ambapali visited the Buddha, gave him her mango grove and invited the Buddha for a meal. And this is told in Mahabharanibbana Sutta. And on the way back from inviting from the meal, she ran into the Lichavi youths, like the princes from the Lichavi clan, who were the leading clan in the area. They said they wanted to invite the Buddha for the meal, and Ambapali said, oh, look, I've already invited him, so bad luck. And they're like, oh, no, we've got to invite him for the meal. And they had this argument about it, and they were very upset anyway. So they went to see the Buddha, and they invited him. Okay. So then, in this later retelling of that story, they then went on to say, the Buddha told about the 5 faults of women. Okay? 5 things that are wrong with women. Okay? This is the Buddha's teachings. And Ambapali just sort of went off. And anyway, they went to see the Buddha. And the Buddha taught them the 5 blessings of being a woman. Okay? So this is a beautiful teaching, right? Because what it's pointing out is that these ideas that being a woman is a bad state, is a negative state, arising from bad karma, these are found in that Buddhist tradition, but they don't come from the Buddha, right? And so the Buddha would always talk about the advantages of being a woman, and many, many suttas where the Buddha talks about how someone can live as a woman and do good karma and live a good life and can be, you know, live a spiritual life and so on and so forth. And of course, very famously, when King Pasenadi had a child and they told him that the child was a daughter, he was disappointed because he wanted a son. And the Buddha said, well, sometimes having a daughter can be even better than having a son. Yeah? And this is something, you think how radical and powerful that is to say to a king in that culture, right? There's so much of this bound up with this idea of having a son. So the idea that being born as a woman is bad karma is something which has no basis in the suttas, no basis in what the Buddha taught, okay? People are people, and people are born into this world, and the important thing is how do we choose to live our life, okay? So all the women who are born here have just the same potential to realize enlightenment as anybody else does, and that's what matters. Okay, so that should be enough for this session. So I think we should probably wrap up around there, and we'll see you for the next session.